Somewhere on a shelf in a computer store in Ohio, a DDR5 memory module is sitting at a price its buyer did not expect. The sticker reflects choices made in Washington in the autumn of 2022, choices that were supposed to make memory more expensive for someone else. The pressure that moved that price did not originate from Chinese demand outrunning supply. It originated from an American policy document that tried to sever a supply link and forged a new one instead. That document was a Commerce Department filing, formalized through entity list additions and expanded chip rules late in 2022 and through 2023 that effectively barred Micron and other American memory suppliers from selling certain advanced dynamic random access memory and NAND flash products to a significant portion of Chinese customers, particularly those with ties to state-backed semiconductor procurement. The chain you are about to follow runs from that filing, through a Chinese factory ramp, through contracted supply that rewired global demand, through a price signal that crossed the Pacific, and terminates at the moment a Western consumer opens a retail page and sees what memory costs now. Follow one object through it, a DDR5 dual inline memory module. It begins as a commodity in a global market and ends as a constrained product in a bifurcated one. Track where it goes. The first link is confirmed. Micron disclosed through public earnings calls and annual filings in 2022 and 2023 that a substantial share of its revenue had been tied to Chinese customers. When the Commerce Department rules took effect, that share became inaccessible in significant part. Micron faced the immediate need to redirect supply, revise demand projections, and absorb the revenue gap that resulted. This was not an ambiguous outcome. The company said so directly in on-the-record investor disclosures. A policy meant to cost China access to advanced memory first extracted a measurable cost from the American firm that had been supplying it. That is confirmed, not inferred. The second link is reported. With American suppliers restricted, or following Chinese government guidance in 2023, informally unwelcome at state-linked buyers, Chinese technology companies faced a gap in their memory supply chains. Hyperscale cloud providers, consumer electronics assemblers, and server manufacturers that had sourced dynamic random access memory from the global market could not replace that supply from existing domestic Chinese producers at scale, not at that moment. What that gap did was legible. It converted domestic Chinese memory producers from a policy ambition into an operational necessity. Changxin Memory Technologies, the Chinese firm focused on dynamic random access memory, and the NAND-focused domestic producer that had already attracted significant attention, began receiving sustained long-term supply contracts and state-directed procurement incentives at a scale they had not previously commanded. Investment figures cited across industry analyst reports, including those from firms that track semiconductor capacity, have been described as running into the tens of billions of yuan for Changxin Memory Technologies alone, across facility expansion and research. Those figures come from analyst estimates and state media announcements, not audited financial disclosures, and should be read as orders of magnitude rather than precise totals. Major Chinese hyperscalers, including Tencent, have been reported as orienting procurement toward domestic supply. That is reported, not confirmed by independent financial audit. The DDR5 module supply chain in this link reroutes. It no longer runs through a Western supplier by default. It runs through a domestic Chinese producer that now has every commercial incentive to scale. Here is where the pivot that determines whether this entire sequence holds or collapses sits: the Changxin Memory Technologies production ramp. If that facility reaches competitive yields on dynamic random access memory at a class equivalent to DDR5 and can sustain that at volume, every other link that follows, the contracted demand, the global supply tightening, the retail price signal, follows mechanically. Each step is a consequence of the one before it. If yields at that facility remain well below what Samsung or SK Hynix achieve on comparable process nodes, then the capacity it consumes in the upstream supply chain is real and measurable. But the competitive threat to established global producers is thinner than the chain implies, and the retail effect becomes noise rather than signal. That single facility's yield curve is where to watch. It is the link on which the entire sequence hangs. The third link is reported, and it is also where the direction of the chain inverts from what the architects of the original policy expected. The export control was designed to prevent Chinese producers from accessing the advanced memory they needed. The gap it created in Chinese procurement became the clearest business case Changxin Memory Technologies had ever had. The investment that followed, the fab expansion, the engineering mobilization, the long-term contracts from domestic hyperscalers, was a direct operational response to the restriction. The pressure to build did not come from Chinese industrial ambition operating in a vacuum. It came from the policy that was supposed to slow that ambition. Changxian Memory Technologies, orienting its ramp toward dynamic random access memory at a class designed to serve Chinese artificial intelligence server and consumer electronics demand, pulled a significant volume of leading-edge memory production capacity, including equipment orders, advanced packaging throughput, and specialized engineering labor, into domestic Chinese production, rather than into the global supply pool that serves markets everywhere else. Reports from industry trackers and spot price monitoring services registered supply commitments outrunning available capacity across the major non-Chinese producers. Backlogs for certain DDR5 configurations, according to analyst commentary from firms covering memory procurement, were described as stretching into 2026 and beyond for large contract buyers, with some procurement managers characterizing specific product tiers as effectively committed through 2027 or 2028. Those projections are not confirmed order book data. They are analyst estimates and procurement channel reporting, and they should be read as directional signals about the tightening, not as audited capacity figures. Think about how a procurement reorientation in one national market propagates into retail pricing in another. Global dynamic random access memory supply operates something like a water main with a fixed flow rate. When a large municipal customer gets cut off and starts drilling its own well, it does not immediately drop your tap pressure. But the well drilling crew, the pipe fittings, the pump equipment, all come from the same supply pool the main draws on. By the time the well is producing, the hardware to maintain the main is harder to source and costs more. The supply tightening that eventually reaches a retail shelf in Ohio did not come from Chinese buyers competing for the same modules. It came from China building the factory to make its own, using the same upstream supply chain, the same equipment makers, the same material suppliers, the same engineering talent pool that serves everyone else. That is the one analogy this chain earns. The mechanism is that indirect and that real. The fourth link is reported. Contract supply tightening in dynamic random access memory propagates into retail channel pricing with a lag. The lag is typically 1 to 3 quarters, consistent with how memory market cycles have behaved historically. DDR5 module prices, which had been declining through most of 2023 as the technology moved from early adopter to mainstream availability, reversed trend. Multiple retail price trackers and spot price indices confirm the directional move. The specific magnitude of the retail price increase attributable specifically to the China policy chain, as distinct from the concurrent surge in artificial intelligence server memory demand, ordinary cyclical inventory patterns, and currency effects, is not separable from publicly available data. Attributing a precise share of the retail move to this chain alone would require information that does not exist in open sources. What is confirmed is the direction. Prices moved. The module that began as a commodity in a falling price environment became a constrained product in a rising price one. The fifth link is inferred. A consumer in a market outside China opens a retail page for DDR5 memory. The price on that page reflects, among other inputs, a supply reorientation triggered by a clause in a Commerce Department filing 2 or 3 years prior. The chain terminates at that moment of purchase. We stop before stating what the module costs because the number is still moving, because the number is a composite of forces this chain is only one of, and because honest reporting on this sequence means naming the mechanism and refusing the false precision of a single retail delta figure that cannot be cleanly attributed to a single cause. The module is in the cart. The chain ends here. The weakest rung in this sequence is also its most consequential, and it deserves the scrutiny it has not fully received yet. Changxian Memory Technologies' actual production yields on dynamic random access memory at DDR5 class remain opaque in open sources. Expansion announcements and contracted procurement from domestic Chinese buyers are publicly traceable in industry coverage and state media. Whether that facility is shipping competitive-grade product at volume or shipping at volume under yield economics that only work under sustained state subsidy is not established in anything accessible to independent verification. If yields are still well below what established global producers achieve on comparable nodes, the capacity being consumed in the upstream supply chain is real, but the structural pressure on global supply is softer than the chain implies. A second soft point is that retail price direction, while confirmed, is a composite signal. Dynamic random access memory pricing reflects artificial intelligence server pull, currency movements, cyclical inventory burn cycles, and a range of demand shocks that have nothing to do with Chinese industrial policy. Separating a specific share of the retail move and assigning it to this chain is a coherent narrative inference. It is not a separable measurement. The chain holds directionally. The mechanism connecting each link is sound. The magnitude at the consumer end is genuine but not precisely assignable to this cause alone, and that gap between directional truth and precise attribution is exactly where this story has to stay honest. Consider what that gap actually means from two positions. Scarcity is what funds the Chinese ramp. Every dollar of elevated dynamic random access memory pricing globally is a margin that makes domestic Chinese production more economically rational to scale. The elevated price that represents a tax on a consumer building a personal computer in Ohio is simultaneously a subsidy signal for the Chinese producer scaling the next fab. Those are not two different outcomes. They are the same outcome observed from two sides of the same chain. That is not a paradox, that is the mechanism. A line in a policy document was intended to raise the cost of advanced memory for Chinese firms. What it raised, measurably and traceable through each link, was the urgency of building domestic Chinese memory capacity. That build-out consumed upstream supply and engineering resources that would otherwise have expanded the global pool. The global pool tightened. Retail prices moved. The chain that opened as a containment measure closed as a cost transfer onto buyers in markets that were never the target. The restriction did not delay the thing it targeted. It funded the argument for it. That is the inversion that runs through every link in this sequence, and that the individual reports, each covering only one link, do not assemble. The Commerce Department filing created the gap. The gap created the business case. The business case created the fab ramp. The fab ramp consumed supply. The supply tightening reached the retail shelf. Each step followed from the one before it. Each individual report was right about its own link. None of them drew the full sequence. The DDR5 module is still in the cart. The policy filing is still in force. Both are simultaneously true, and both are expressions of the same chain. Contained is not the same thing as slowed, and slowed is not the same thing as stopped. Watch the next 2 quarters of Changxin Memory Technologies yield disclosures. If competitive-grade dynamic random access memory starts shipping at scale from Chinese fabs, the chain bifurcates into 2 separate markets with 2 separate price trajectories, and the retail signal in Ohio decouples from the global one. If yields stay suppressed, the supply tightening softens, and the retail pressure